1. The worst part isn't that he broke your heart. It's realizing he never thought it was worth holding in the first place. Luca Hale didn't mean to stop walking, but his body did anyway. Right there in the middle of the mall, under bright white lights and the hum of weekend noise, his fingers tightening around the thin plastic handles of a grocery bag digging into his palm like it was trying to anchor him to the moment. He knew that voice. He'd know it anywhere, even after everything, even after months of forcing himself not to remember it. And for a second, he considered pretending. Just keep moving, don't turn around, don't give him the satisfaction. But it was too late, because the silence behind him stretched just enough to demand it. And when Luca turned, there he was, Brandon Cross, standing like he belonged to a completely different world. Sharp suit, effortless confidence, the kind of presence that used to make Luca feel safe and now just made his chest tighten. Brandon's eyes moved over him slowly, taking in everything, the cheaper clothes, the tired posture, the subtle way Luca shifted his weight like standing too long hurt more than it should. And then that familiar half-smile appeared, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Luca, he said, like he was testing the name, like it was something he'd misplaced and just found again. Didn't expect to see you here. Luca forced his grip to loosen before the bag snapped. I'm just shopping, he replied, keeping his tone flat, neutral, like this was nothing, like Brandon was nothing. Excuse me. He tried to step past, but Brandon moved with him, smooth, deliberate, blocking his path without even touching him, and somehow that made it worse. That's it? Brandon tilted his head slightly, studying him. You disappear on me, and now I get excuse me in a grocery aisle? Luca let out a breath through his nose, his patience thinner than he wanted it to be. You told me to leave, he said, meeting Brandon's eyes for the first time. I did exactly what you wanted. For a split second, something flickered across Brandon's face. Annoyance, maybe, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by that same controlled calm. I said a lot of things, he shrugged, like words didn't matter, like they didn't stick. You didn't have to take them so seriously. Luca almost laughed at that, but it came out sharper than intended. Right. My mistake. He shifted again, and this time his hand instinctively brushed his stomach, a small, protective motion he didn't even think about anymore. And that was all it took. Brandon's gaze dropped, his expression sharpening, interest replacing indifference in an instant. What's that? He asked quietly, stepping closer, and Luca immediately felt the difference, the space closing in, the air getting heavier. Nothing, Luca said quickly, pulling his arm back, but it was too late. Brandon had already seen. Enough, you're pregnant, Brandon said, not a question, his tone changing, more focused now, more intent, and Luca felt his pulse spike. That's none of your concern. Brandon let out a short, disbelieving laugh, running a hand through his hair like he was trying to process it. None of my. Luca, you vanish, and now you show up like this. His eyes flicked back to Luca's face, searching, calculating. How far along? Luca shook his head, stepping back. Stop. Is it mine? The question came fast, direct, cutting through everything else. And for a moment Luca couldn't breathe, the words hitting harder than he expected, because of course this was where Brandon's mind went. Not concern, not care, ownership. Luca's jaw tightened. No, Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly, like he didn't believe him, like he was already deciding the truth for himself. You're a terrible liar, he said quietly, stepping forward again, and Luca's back hit the edge of a display behind him. Nowhere left to go. I'm not lying. Luca shot back, his voice shaking despite how hard he tried to keep it steady. And even if I was, you don't get to ask. Brandon's expression hardened, irritation creeping in. I get to ask if you're carrying my kid, he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, but the pressure behind it unmistakable, and Luca felt it in his chest, that old instinct to shrink, to give in, but he didn't, not this time. You don't get anything from me, Luca said, louder now, the words coming faster, fueled by something stronger than fear. You made that clear the second you told me I meant nothing. Brandon's jaw clenched, his patience clearly wearing thin. Don't start rewriting history, he muttered, stepping closer again, and Luca instinctively leaned back, his heel catching slightly on the polished floor, his balance shifting just enough for panic to spike, his hand flying to his stomach as the world tilted for a split second. And then it stopped, a firm, steady arm catching him before he could lose his footing completely, strong and unyielding, pulling him back into place like gravity, had suddenly changed sides. Easy, a calm voice said near his ear, low, controlled, nothing like the tension that had been building, and Luca's breath hitched as he steadied himself, his fingers gripping the sleeve of the man beside him, the fabric smooth, expensive, solid. You okay? The man asked quietly, and Luca nodded before he even realized it, his heartbeat still racing, and when he looked up, he saw him, Roman DeLuca, composed, unreadable, his presence quiet but overwhelming in a way. That immediately shifted everything. Brandon took a step back, his eyes flicking between them, confusion edging into his expression. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, a hint of irritation creeping in, like he wasn't used to being interrupted. Roman didn't rush to answer, his attention lingering on Luca for a brief second longer, making sure he was steady before finally turning his gaze to Brandon, and when he spoke, his tone stayed even, calm, but carried something underneath it that made the air feel different, heavier. "Someone who doesn't appreciate the way you're speaking to him," he said simply. Brandon scoffed, crossing his arms slightly. "This doesn't concern you." Roman's expression didn't change, not even a flicker. "It does when it involves my husband," he replied, and the word landed with quiet precision, like it had been waiting there all along. Silence followed, sharp and immediate, Brandon's expression freezing for just a second as the meaning caught up with him. "You're what?" he asked, incredulous, almost laughing, but there was something uncertain underneath it now. Roman didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer, but somehow he didn't need to. "You heard me," he said, his hand still steady at Luca's side, not gripping, not controlling, just there, solid and certain. "So I suggest you take a step back." And for the first time since Brandon had said his name, Luca realized he could finally breathe. 2. The cruelest thing about loving someone isn't that they can break you. It's that they can do it without even noticing. It had been a quiet night, the kind Luca used to think meant something. The city glowing softly through Brandon's floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything washed in warm gold light that made the world feel softer than it really was. And Luca remembered standing there, barefoot on polished floors that didn't quite feel like his, holding on to a moment he didn't realize was already gone. Brandon didn't look at him right away, just stood by the counter scrolling through his phone like Luca's presence didn't require acknowledgement anymore, like whatever they had already slipped into something forgettable. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the silence itself, but how normal it seemed to him. "You're still here?" Brandon said after a while, not harsh, not even annoyed, just mildly surprised, like Luca had overstayed without realizing it. And Luca felt something small and fragile inside him falter at the casualness of it. "You asked me to come," he replied, his voice careful, trying to keep it steady, trying not to read too much into a tone that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Brandon hummed under his breath, finally setting his phone aside, turning just enough to look at him. And there it was, that shift. Subtle but unmistakable, like a door closing behind his eyes. "Right," he said, exhaling slowly. "We should talk." Luca's chest tightened instantly, because those words never meant anything good. Not when they came like that. Not when they sounded like a conclusion instead of a conversation. About what? He asked anyway, even though part of him already knew, even though part of him didn't want to hear it said out loud. Brandon leaned back against the counter, arms folding loosely, completely at ease, like this was just another task to get through. "About us," he said, and then, after a beat, like he was simplifying it for convenience, or whatever this is. Luca felt the words hit in pieces, not all at once, like his mind was trying to slow them down before they could land fully. "What do you mean?" he asked, quieter now, because suddenly speaking felt like stepping on a thin ice. Brandon shrugged, like it was obvious, like Luca had missed something everyone else could see. "It's not working," he said simply. Not working, like they were a project, like something mechanical that had failed a basic test, and Luca's fingers curled slightly at his sides, grounding himself in the feeling of something solid. "Since when?" he asked, because that part mattered, because there had to be a moment, a reason, something he could trace back to. Brandon tilted his head, thinking for a second, but not deeply, not like it was important. "I don't know," he said, "a while." A while. Luca's throat tightened, because that meant all those recent moments, all the things he had held on to, had already been hollow. You could have told me, he said, the words slipping out softer than he intended. Less accusation, more confusion. Brandon let out a small breath, something close to impatience. And what would that change? He asked, genuinely, like he didn't see the point. Dragging it out doesn't make it better. Lucas stared at him, searching for something. Regret, hesitation, anything that suggested this wasn't easy. But there was nothing there except a calm detachment that made everything feel unreal. I thought we were okay, Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper now, because saying it any louder might make it sound naive. Brandon's lips pressed into a thin line, not unkind, just firm. You thought wrong, he said. The words landed harder than anything else, not because they were loud, but because they were absolute, leaving no space for argument, no room for interpretation, and Luca felt his chest tighten painfully, like something inside him was being forced to shrink to fit a truth he hadn't agreed to. Was any of it real? He asked before he could stop himself, the question breaking through everything he had been trying to hold together. Brandon didn't hesitate, didn't even look conflicted. It was fun, he said, like that explained everything, like that was enough. Fun, the word echoed in Luca's head, clashing violently with every memory he had, every late night, every quiet moment, every time he had believed there was something more beneath the surface. And suddenly those memories felt different, thinner, like they had been built on something that was never actually there. Fun, Luca repeated, his voice unsteady now, because he needed to hear it again to believe it. That's all I was to you? Brandon shrugged again, a small, almost dismissive movement. Don't make it sound worse than it is, he said. We had a good time. That's it. Luca let out a breath that felt like it scraped on the way out, his vision blurring slightly before he blinked it clear, refusing to let himself break down in front of someone who clearly wouldn't care. You told me you cared, he said, not accusing, just stating it like a fact that didn't fit anymore. Brandon's expression didn't change. I said what made sense at the time, he replied, and that was it. No apology, no softness, just a clean separation between then and now, like feelings had expiration dates, and Luca had missed the memo. Something inside Luca cracked then, quiet but final, like glass under pressure. I trusted you, he said, the words coming out raw before he could filter them, because that was the part that hurt the most, not just losing Brandon, but realizing how much of himself he had handed over without realizing it. Brandon's eyes narrowed slightly, irritation finally surfacing. And I didn't ask you to, he said, sharper now. That was your choice. Luca felt the weight of that settle over him, heavy and suffocating, because Brandon was right in a way that made it worse, because it meant this wasn't something taken from him. It was something he had given, freely, blindly, and now there was nothing left to reclaim. Silence filled the space between them, thick and uncomfortable, but only for Luca, because Brandon looked ready to move on, ready to. And this like closing a tab he no longer needed. So what now? Luca asked. Even though the answer was already clear, Brandon pushed himself off the counter, stepping aside just enough to open a path toward the door, a silent gesture that said more than any words could. Now you go, he said simply, and we both move on. Luca nodded slowly, because there was nothing else to do, nothing left to argue, nothing left to hold on to, and he turned toward the door, each step heavier than the last, like he was walking through something thick and invisible that didn't want to let him leave. His hand rested on the handle, and for one last second, he waited, not for a grand gesture, not for an apology, just for something small, something human, something that would tell him he hadn't imagined everything that it had meant. Something, even briefly. But behind him, there was only silence, the faint sound of Brandon picking his phone back up, already moving on. Luca closed his eyes for a brief moment, steadying himself, and then he opened the door and stepped out. The hallway colder than the apartment had been, the air sharper in his lungs, and as the door clicked shut behind him, he realized that whatever he had lost in that room wasn't coming back. And maybe the worst part wasn't that Brandon had let him go, it was that, to Brandon, there had never been anything to lose at all. 3. Sometimes life does not break you all at once. Sometimes it waits until you are already on the ground, and then hands you something fragile and asks if you are strong enough to hold it. The hallway outside Brandon's apartment had felt colder than it should have that night, the kind of cold that sank through Luca's jacket and settled deep in his chest, and he had stood there for longer than he wanted to admit, staring at the closed door behind him like it might open again, like something inside might change if he just waited long enough. But nothing did, and eventually he forced himself to move, one step at a time down a corridor that seemed too long, too quiet, like it was, stretching just to remind him how alone he was now. The next few weeks blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable, days slipping into nights without anything solid to mark them, Luca moving through them on autopilot, picking up extra shifts wherever he could, ignoring the dull ache in his body that kept getting harder to dismiss, telling himself it was just exhaustion, just stress, just the aftermath of everything he had lost, because that explanation was easier, safer, something he could control. His apartment was small, barely more than a room with thin walls and a window that faced a brick building only a few feet away, the kind of place where sunlight struggled to get in and silence never felt peaceful. But it was all he had, and he made it work the way people do when they have no other choice, stacking cheap groceries on a narrow counter, folding clothes into neat piles to make the space feel less temporary, like if he tried hard enough it might start to feel like home. But his body kept reminding him that something was off, subtle at first, a constant fatigue that sleep did not fix, a faint nausea that came and went without warning, a strange sensitivity that made ordinary things feel overwhelming. And Luca ignored it longer than he should have, because acknowledging it meant asking questions he was not ready to answer. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything finally caught up to him, the kind of ordinary day that should not have meant anything. Gray sky, light rain tapping softly against the window. Luca standing in the cramped bathroom of his apartment, staring down at a small white stick in his hand like it was something foreign, something that did not belong to him. He had bought it without thinking too much, just in case, just to rule it out, telling himself it was unnecessary, that there was no way, that his body was just reacting to stress. But now that it was here, now that the moment had arrived, his hands felt unsteady in a way he could not control. The seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one dragging, heavy with a kind of quiet dread that made it hard to breathe, and Luca found himself counting without meaning to, his eyes fixed on the small screen like if he looked away it might change, might disappear, might give him a different answer. When the result finally appeared, it did not come with noise or warning, just two faint lines that slowly grew clearer the longer he stared at them. And for a moment Luca did not understand what he was seeing, his mind refusing to connect the meaning to the image, because once it did, everything would change. No, he whispered under his breath, the words slipping out automatically, not in denial exactly, but in disbelief, like he needed to hear himself say it before it could become real. He sank back against the wall, the cool tile pressing against his shoulders, the test still clutched in his hand as his thoughts began to spiral, fast and disjointed, pieces of memory colliding with the reality in front of him, Brandon's voice echoing somewhere in the back of his mind. The way he had dismissed everything so easily, the way he had walked away without looking back, and now this small, undeniable truth that tied Luca to something bigger than the pain he had just barely started to process. His first instinct was fear, sharp and immediate, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to think straight, because he was alone, because he had nothing steady to hold on to, because the future that stretched out in front of him suddenly felt uncertain in a way he had never experienced before, and for a few seconds all he could think about was everything that could go wrong, every obstacle, every question he did not have answers to. But beneath the fear, quieter and more fragile, something else began to surface, something he did not expect, something he could not immediately push away, a small, tentative warmth that settled low in his chest, growing slowly as the reality sank in, and Luca found his hand moving again without thinking, this time not in defense, but in something closer to instinct, resting lightly over his stomach like he was trying to feel something that was not there yet, something that existed only as a possibility, a promise. His breathing steadied little by little, the initial shock giving way to something more complicated, a mix of fear and wonder that did not cancel each other out, but existed side by side. And Luca closed his eyes. For a moment, letting himself sit in it, letting himself feel it without trying to categorize it, Because for the first time in weeks, his thoughts were not only about what he had lost, but about something new, something that did not belong to the past. Okay, he said quietly, the word barely audible, but it carried a different weight than it had before, not resignation, not defeat, but something closer to acceptance. Even if it was uncertain, even if it was fragile, he opened his eyes again, looking down at the test one more time. The line still there, still clear, still impossible to ignore, and instead of looking away, he held on to it a little tighter, like it was the first real thing he had been given in a long time, and maybe, just maybe, the first thing that was entirely his. 4. Survival is not loud or heroic most days. It is quiet and exhausting and done one small decision at a time. The first thing Luca learned was how expensive everything felt when you had no one to fall back on. How every dollar suddenly carried weight. How every choice had consequences that stretched further than he could see. And the small apartment that had once felt manageable now felt like something he had to constantly fight to keep. The rent due every month like a clock he could not stop. The numbers never quite adding up no matter how many times he went over them in his head. Mornings came too early and nights ended too late. Luca moving through them with a kind of stubborn determination that surprised even him, pulling on worn shoes, grabbing whatever food he could afford, and heading out into a city that did not notice him, did not care if he was tired or hurting or scared, just kept moving like it always had. He picked up extra shifts wherever he could find them, long hours on his feet that left his back aching and his legs heavy, smiling when he had to, keeping his head down when he did not, learning quickly that there was no space for weakness when you were trying to hold everything together on your own. Some days were manageable, predictable in their own quiet way, but others were harder, the kind that crept up without warning, a sudden wave of nausea that forced him to pause mid-task, a sharp dizziness that made the world tilt just enough to scare him, and he would steady himself against whatever was nearby, breathing slowly, waiting for it to pass because it always had to pass. There was no other option. He stopped buying things he did not absolutely need, counting every expense, choosing the cheaper brand even when it tasted worse, skipping meals when his stomach felt too unsettled to eat anyway, telling himself it was temporary, that he could handle this, that he had to handle this. The nights were the hardest, when the city quieted down just enough for his thoughts to get louder, when the small space of his apartment felt even smaller, the silence pressing in from all sides, and Luca would sit on the edge of his bed, one hand resting lightly over his stomach without thinking, the gesture becoming more natural with each passing day, like his body understood something his mind was still trying to catch up to. I am trying, he whispered. Once, the words barely audible, not sure who he was saying it to. Maybe to himself, maybe to the small life he could not yet feel, but the act of saying it made something in his chest steady, just a little. There were moments when doubt crept in, sharp and relentless, questions he did not have answers to piling up in his mind. How he was going to afford everything, how he was going to manage on his own, what kind of future he could offer when he was still struggling to build one for himself. And sometimes it felt like too much, like standing at the edge of something too big to understand. But every time those thoughts threatened to overwhelm him, something else pushed back, quieter but stronger, a simple refusal to give up, because this was not just about him anymore. One evening, after a long shift that had left him more exhausted than usual, Luca found himself sitting on the floor of his apartment instead of the bed, his back against the wall, the dim light casting soft shadows around him, and for a moment he allowed himself to just sit there without moving, without planning, without calculating what came next, and his hand moved again, resting over his stomach with a kind of careful awareness. We are okay, he said softly, even though he was not entirely sure if that was true yet. But the words felt important, like something he needed to believe before it could become real. The fear never fully went away. It lingered at the edges of everything he did, a constant reminder of how fragile his situation was. But it no longer felt like the only thing there, because alongside it was something else, something steady and growing, a quiet kind of strength Luca had not known he possessed until he had no choice but to find it. And as he sat there in that small apartment, surrounded by everything he did not have, he realized that somehow, despite all of it, he was still moving forward, one day at a time, one breath at a time, holding on to something that made the struggle feel like it mattered. 5. Some people do not enter your life loudly. They arrive in the exact moment you are about to fall, and somehow, everything changes. It had been a long day, longer than most, the kind that settled deep into Luca's bones and refused to let go. His steps slower than usual as he pushed through the glass doors of a convenience store just off the corner of his street, the bell above the door chiming softly as he entered, the warm, artificial light inside a sharp contrast to the cool evening air outside. He did not need much, just a few things to get through the next couple of days. Something simple, something cheap, and he moved through the narrow aisles with quiet efficiency, scanning prices more than products, doing the mental math that had become second nature, always calculating, always adjusting. By the time he reached the counter, his head felt a little too light, a familiar warning he had learned not to ignore but could not always prevent, and he steadied himself subtly, one hand resting briefly against the edge of the counter as he set his items down, hoping the cashier would not notice, hoping he could just get through this and go home. That will be $12.43, the cashier said without looking up, and Luca reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills and loose coins, counting them quickly, once, then again, his stomach tightening when the numbers did not quite line up the way he needed them to. He exhaled slowly, trying to think, trying to figure out what he could put back, what he could go without. Sorry, just a second, he murmured, his fingers moving through the small pile again, as if the amount might change if he counted it differently. You are short, the cashier said flatly, finally glancing up, impatience already settling into his tone, and Luca felt heat rise to his face, a quiet embarrassment that pressed heavier than it should have. I know, Luca said quickly, his voice low, already reaching for one of the items. I will just take this out. But before he could finish, before he could decide which small necessity mattered less, a hand moved into his line of sight, calm and deliberate, placing a card on the counter beside his things. It is fine, a voice said, steady and composed in a way that immediately cut through the tension, and Luca stilled, his fingers pausing, mid-motion as he turned slightly, confusion flickering across his face. The man standing beside him did not look like he belonged in a place like this, tall, composed, dressed in a dark coat that fit too well to be accidental, his presence quiet but unmistakable, like the room had shifted around him without anyone noticing, and Luca found himself caught for a second, not because of what the man had done, but because of how easily he had done it. You do not have to, Luca started, instinct kicking in, the need to refuse, to not owe anyone anything. But the man shook his head once, a small, decisive movement that ended the sentence before it could fully form. It is already done, he said, his tone even, not dismissive, just certain, as the cashier processed the payment without question, the receipt printing with a soft mechanical hum. Luca hesitated, unsure what to say, his mind still catching up to the moment. I can pay you back, he added after a second, because that felt important, because it was the only way to make sense of something that did not fit into his world. The man's gaze shifted to him then, sharp but not unkind, studying him in a way that felt different from anything Luca had experienced before, not invasive, not demanding, just aware. You can keep it, he replied simply, picking up the small bag and handing it to Luca like it was the most natural thing in the world, like there was no imbalance in the exchange. Luca took it slowly, his fingers brushing against the man's for just a second, the contact brief but grounding, and something about that moment made it harder to look away, harder to treat this like a simple act of kindness he could forget. Why? Luca asked before he could stop himself, the question quiet but honest, because nothing in his recent life had been given without reason. The man regarded him for a moment longer, and for the first time, something almost subtle passed through his expression, not quite a smile, not quite softness, but something that felt intentional. Because you needed it, he said, as if that alone was enough, as if it required no further explanation. Luca frowned slightly, not fully convinced, not used to that kind of answer. But before he could press further, the man stepped back, creating just enough distance to signal the end of the interaction. Take care of yourself, he added, his voice quieter now, but no less steady, and then he turned, moving toward the door with the same composed presence he had arrived with, the bell chiming again as he stepped out into the evening. Luca stood there for a second longer than necessary, the small bag still in his hands, the weight of it unchanged and, yet somehow different, his mind replaying the brief exchange in a loop that did not quite settle. And when he finally stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face, he found himself looking down the street, searching without meaning to. But the man was already gone, leaving behind nothing but the faint impression of something that felt significant, even if Luca could not yet explain why. 6. Some offers do not sound dangerous until you realize how much they are about to change your life. Luca thought that would be the last time he ever saw him, just a stranger in a quiet store who had stepped in for a moment and disappeared just as quickly. And for a few days, life went back to what it had been: long shifts, tight budgets, quiet nights. But something about that encounter lingered in a way Luca could not explain, like a thought that refused to settle. It was late in the evening when he saw him again, not in a place that felt accidental this time, but outside his building, leaning slightly against a dark car that looked far too expensive for the cracked sidewalk it was parked beside, the streetlight casting a soft glow over the scene. And for a second Luca stopped walking, his body going still. Before his mind caught up, the man straightened when he noticed him, composed as ever, like he had been waiting, not impatiently, just certain, and that alone sent a quiet wave of unease through Luca. "You found me," Luca said before he could stop himself, the words coming out more cautious than accusing, his grip tightening slightly on the strap of his bag. The man's expression did not change, but his eyes held the same steady awareness as before. "I did," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. Luca exhaled slowly, glancing around instinctively. The street mostly empty, the city quieter at this hour. "Why?" he asked, because that question had not left him since the convenience store, because nothing about this felt random anymore. The man took a step closer, not enough to crowd him, but enough to close the distance into something intentional. "Because I wanted to speak with you," he said, his tone calm, controlled, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Lucas' brows drew together slightly, suspicion edging in. "About what?" he asked, already preparing himself for something complicated, something he did not have the energy for. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, but precision, like the man was choosing his words carefully, and then, "Your situation," he said, his gaze dropping briefly, not intrusively, but knowingly, to Luca's stomach before returning to his face. Luca's body tensed immediately, instinct flaring. "You do not know anything about my situation," he replied, sharper now, protective, his hand unconsciously moving again to rest over his stomach. "I know enough," the man said evenly, not defensive, not dismissive, just stating it like fact. "You are working too many hours. You are not eating properly. And you are trying to manage something you should not have to manage alone." Luca's breath caught slightly, not because the words were wrong, but because they were too accurate, too direct, and for a second he did not know how to respond, because no one had said it out loud before, no one had seen it that clearly. "You have been watching me," Luca said finally, the realization settling in with a mix of unease and something harder to define. The man did not deny it. "I have been paying attention," he corrected, his tone still calm, like there was a difference that mattered. Luca let out a short, incredulous breath, shaking his head slightly. "That does not make it better," he muttered, his instincts telling him to leave, to walk away before this became something he could not control, but his feet stayed where they were. "Perhaps not," the man agreed, and then, without changing his tone, without building up to it, he said, "Marry me." The words landed in the quiet space between them like something unreal, too simple for the weight they carried, and for a moment Luca just stared at him, certain he had misheard. "What?" he asked, the single word slipping out before he could filter it. "Marry me," the man repeated, just as calmly, as if he were offering something ordinary, something reasonable. Luca blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "You cannot be serious," he said, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping him despite himself, because this had to be a joke, had to be some kind of misunderstanding. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," the man said again, and there was something in the repetition that made it feel deliberate, grounded, "and I am not asking for something without purpose." Luca shook his head, taking a step back now, putting space between them like it might make the conversation make more sense. "This is insane," he said, more firmly. "You helped me once. That does not mean you get to. This is not about that." The man interrupted, not raising his voice, but cutting through Luca's words with quiet authority. "This is an arrangement. Lucas stilled slightly at that, his confusion shifting into something more cautious. An arrangement, he repeated, slower now. The man nodded once. You need stability, he said, laying it out with the same clarity as everything else. Financial security, medical care, a safe environment for you and your child. Each word landed with uncomfortable precision, naming things Luca had been trying not to think about all at once, and before he could respond, the man continued, I can provide those things. Luca's throat tightened, because this was exactly what he had been struggling with, exactly what kept him awake at night. But hearing it offered like this, so cleanly, so directly, made it feel dangerous in a different way. And what do you get? Luca asked quietly, because there was always something, there had to be. The man held his gaze steadily. A marriage that serves a purpose, he said, not evasive, but not fully revealing either. Publicly, it benefits me. Privately, it ensures you are protected. Luca frowned, searching his face for something more, something that made it make sense, but all he found was that same calm certainty, that same unshakable presence. And that is it? Luca asked, because it felt like there had to be more, something hidden beneath the simplicity. That is it, the man confirmed. And then, after a brief pause, he added, I do not make offers lightly. Silence stretched between them again. But this time it felt different, heavier, filled with possibilities Luca had not allowed himself to consider before, and his mind raced through every angle, every risk, every unknown. Because this was not just a decision, it was a turning point, something that could change everything, for better or worse. Why me? Luca asked finally, the question quieter now, more honest than anything he had said before. The man regarded him for a moment, something unreadable passing through his eyes before settling back into that steady calm. Because you need it, he said, echoing his words from before, but this time they carried more weight, more intention, and because I choose you. Luca's chest tightened at that, not from fear this time, but from the weight of being seen, of being singled out in a way. He did not understand, and for a moment, the world felt very still, like everything was waiting for his answer. 7. The most dangerous choices are not the ones forced on you, but the ones you convince yourself you have no choice but to make. Luca did not answer right away, and the silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, the kind that made every thought louder, every doubt sharper, his mind racing through everything Roman had said and everything he had not, because that was the part that unsettled him most, not the offer itself, but how clean it sounded, how perfectly it fit into every problem Luca had been trying to survive on his own. He could walk away. He knew that. He could turn around, go back to his apartment. Keep working, keep struggling, keep telling himself he could handle it. But the truth sat heavier now, undeniable, pressing against him from every angle, because it was not just about him anymore, and that changed everything. You said it is an arrangement, Luca said finally, his voice quieter now, more controlled, like he was trying to hold on to something steady in the middle of a storm. So what happens when you are done with it? Roman's gaze did not waver. I do not discard things that serve a purpose, he replied, and the wording was careful, precise, but not comforting, and Luca felt that, the subtle difference between reassurance and reality. That is not an answer, Luca said, his grip tightening slightly on the strap of his bag, because he needed clarity, needed something solid to stand on. But Roman only tilted his head slightly, as if considering how much to say. It is the only one that matters, he said. Luca let out a slow breath, frustration and unease mixing in a way that made it hard to think clearly. You talk like this is simple, he said, shaking his head slightly. It is not. No, Roman agreed, and that alone made Luca pause, because it was not the response he expected. It is not simple. It is necessary. The words settled heavily between them, and Luca felt it sink in deeper than anything else, because necessity did not leave room for comfort, for emotion, for choice in the way he wanted it to. For you, Luca said, a quiet challenge in his tone. Roman's expression remained unchanged. For both of us, he corrected, and then, after a brief pause, he added, but you are the one with less time. Luca's breath caught, his body going still as the implication landed, not harshly, not aggressively, but with a kind of quiet certainty that made it impossible to ignore, his hand instinctively moving to his stomach again, the gesture automatic now. protective, grounding, and Roman's gaze followed it for just a second before returning to Luca's face. You cannot keep doing what you are doing, Roman continued, his voice steady, not raised, not forceful, but firm in a way that left little room for argument. You are already pushing your limits. Eventually, that will not be enough. Luca swallowed, because he knew that he had felt it in the long hours, the exhaustion that never fully went away, the moments where his body simply refused to keep up with his will, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way he could not deny. And you think this is the only solution? Luca asked, his voice softer now, not because he was convinced, but because he was running out of ways to argue against something that made sense. Roman took a step closer, not invading, but closing the distance just enough to make his presence undeniable. I think it is the best one you have, he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no pressure in the traditional sense, just a statement delivered with complete confidence. Luca looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something. Manipulation, cruelty, anything that would make it easier to reject. But all he found was that same controlled calm, that same certainty that did not bend or shift, and somehow that made it harder, not easier, because there was no obvious reason to refuse, only the quiet fear of what accepting would mean. And if I say no? Luca asked, the question barely above a whisper now. Roman did not hesitate. Then you walk away, he said simply, and nothing changes. The words were straightforward, but they landed with a weight Luca could not ignore, because nothing changing was exactly the problem, because nothing changing meant going back to the same struggle, the same uncertainty, the same quiet fear that followed him everywhere now. Silence settled again, thicker this time, filled with everything Luca was not saying, everything he was trying to process, and he closed his eyes for a brief moment, just long enough to steady himself, to push past the noise in his head and focus on what mattered, on what he could not afford to ignore anymore. When he opened them again, his gaze was different, not resolved, not confident, but clearer, like he had reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. If I agree, Luca said slowly, each word deliberate. This stays exactly what you said it is. An arrangement. Nothing more. Roman held his gaze for a moment, assessing, and then nodded once. Of course, he said, the answer immediate, effortless. Luca knew that might not be entirely true, that nothing this significant ever stayed simple, but he needed to believe it, needed something to hold on to, even if it was only temporary. Then fine, Luca said, the word heavier than he expected, settling somewhere deep in his chest. I will do it. The moment the words left his mouth, something shifted, subtle but irreversible, like a door closing behind him, and for a second, he felt it, the weight of the decision, the quiet realization that there was no easy way back from this, that whatever came next would not look anything like the life he had been trying to hold together. Roman studied him for a brief moment longer, as if confirming something only he understood, and then, with the same calm certainty as before, he said, good. And, somehow, that single word felt like the beginning of something Luca was not entirely sure he was ready for. 8. Control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like everything being decided before you even realize you had a choice. The car ride had been quiet, not uncomfortable, but not easy either, the kind of silence that carried weight, and Luca sat in the passenger seat with his hands folded loosely in his lap, watching the city blur past through tinted glass that softened the world outside into something distant and unreachable. Roman had not said much after Luca agreed, only given a brief instruction to get in, as if the decision had already set everything else in motion. And now, as the car turned onto a quieter street lined with tall buildings and guarded entrances, Luca felt it settle deeper in his chest that he had crossed into something he did not fully understand. The building they stopped in front of did not look like anywhere Luca had ever lived. The entrance polished, the lighting warm and intentional, a doorman stepping forward before the car had fully stopped, and Luca hesitated for half a second before opening the door, his body still catching up to the reality of where he was. Roman was already out, already moving, his pace unhurried but certain, and Luca found himself following without being told, the subtle pull of Roman's presence guiding the moment more than any direct command. The elevator ride was smooth, silent, the numbers climbing steadily, and Luca became aware of small things he had not expected to notice. The faint scent of something clean and expensive, The way the space felt insulated from everything outside, like nothing messy or uncertain could reach this far up. When the doors opened, the hallway was quiet, carpeted, the kind of quiet that felt intentional, and Roman stepped forward, unlocking a door with a simple motion before pushing it open and stepping aside just enough for Luca to enter first. A small gesture that might have felt polite if it did not also feel like something else, something measured. Luca stepped inside slowly, his gaze moving across the space without meaning to, taking in details he could not ignore. The clean lines, the soft lighting, the absence of clutter, everything in its place in a way that made his own apartment feel like a distant memory, something smaller, less stable. "You will stay here," Roman said behind him, his voice even, like he was stating something already decided. And Luca turned slightly, his fingers tightening just a little at his sides. "Stay," he repeated, the word sitting differently now than it had when it was just an idea. Roman nodded once, stepping further into the space. "Your things will be brought tomorrow," he added, and that was when Luca paused, something in his chest tightening again. "My things?" he asked, his voice careful, because he had not agreed to that part, had not even thought that far ahead. "There is no reason for you to return there," Roman said simply, not dismissive, but final, like it was the most logical conclusion, and Luca felt that again. That subtle shift where options seemed to disappear without being directly taken away. "I did not say I was moving in permanently," Luca said, the words coming out more controlled than he felt, because he needed to hold on to something, some sense that he still had a say in this. Roman's gaze settled on him, steady, unreadable. "You agreed to marry me," he replied, his tone unchanged. "This is where that begins." The words were not harsh, but they carried weight, and Luca felt it press against him. The reality of what he had said yes to unfolding in ways he had not fully considered. "That does not mean you get to decide everything for me," Luca said quietly, and for a moment, the space between them held something sharper, something closer to resistance. Roman did not react immediately, and when he did, it was not with irritation or dismissal, but with a slight shift in posture, like he was recalibrating. Rather than confronting, "You are right," he said, and the agreement caught Luca off guard just enough to pause him. "But some things are not optional," Roman continued, his voice still calm, still controlled. "Your safety is one of them." Luca held his gaze, searching for the line between control and concern, and finding it harder to define than he expected. "I am not helpless," Luca said after a moment, quieter now, but no less firm. "I know," Roman replied, and there was something different in the way he said it. Not dismissive, not indulgent, just certain. "That is why you are still here." The answer lingered, settling somewhere Luca could not easily argue with, and for a second, neither of them moved, the silence shifting into something less tense, but no less charged. "There is food in the kitchen," Roman added after a moment, his tone returning to something more neutral. "You should eat," Luca almost said. He was not hungry, the reflex automatic, but something in the way Roman said it made it feel less like a suggestion and more like something that had already been decided, and instead, he hesitated, then nodded once, a small concession that felt larger than it should have. As he moved toward the kitchen, he became aware of the way Roman did not follow immediately, did not hover, but also did not fully leave, his presence still there, steady, watchful in a way that was not intrusive but impossible to ignore. And Luca realized then that this was what it meant, not force, not overt control, but a kind of quiet certainty that shaped everything around it. Decisions made before they needed to be spoken, boundaries drawn in ways that were hard to see until you were already standing inside them. He reached the counter, his hand resting lightly against the surface as he exhaled slowly, his other hand moving again, almost unconsciously, to his stomach, grounding himself in something that was still his, still real, and for the first time since stepping into the apartment, he allowed himself to acknowledge it fully. This was not temporary, not something he could step out of when it became uncomfortable. This was something he had chosen, even if the choice had not felt entirely like his own. And somewhere behind him, Roman's voice came again, softer this time, but no less steady. "You will be taken care of here." And Luca closed his eyes for just a second, because he was starting to understand that in Roman's world, being taken care of did not always feel the same as being free. 9. Routine is a quiet kind of control, the kind that makes you forget you ever lived differently. The first morning Luca woke up in Roman's apartment. It took him a few seconds to remember where he was. The ceiling above him unfamiliar, the sheets softer than anything he had owned, the silence too complete, like the city had been muted somewhere far below, and for a brief moment, before everything settled back into place, there was a strange sense of disorientation, like he had stepped into someone else's life by mistake. He pushed himself up slowly, one hand instinctively resting on his stomach. He sat there, letting the stillness settle around him. And then he noticed it, small but deliberate, a glass of water on the bedside table, placed within easy reach, something he knew had not been there when he went to sleep. Luca stared at it for a second longer than necessary, a quiet awareness settling in that this was not accidental, that nothing here seemed to be, and he reached for it without thinking, taking a small sip as he exhaled softly. The apartment was quiet when he stepped out of the room, the kind of quiet that felt maintained rather than natural. And as he moved through the space, he began to notice more of those small details, things that had been adjusted without his input, without his knowledge, but clearly with him in mind. The temperature slightly warmer than the rest of the building, the lighting softer in the areas he passed through, even the kitchen counter organized in a way that made things easier to reach, as if someone had already mapped out his movements. Before he made them, Roman was already there, standing near the kitchen, dressed as if the day had already begun for him hours ago, his presence as composed and controlled as it had been the night before, and when his gaze shifted to Luca, it was brief but intentional, taking in more than it seemed to at first glance. "You should eat before you leave," Roman said, his tone even, like this was simply part of the day's structure, not a suggestion, not a command, just something that existed. Luca hesitated for a fraction of a second, the word leave catching his attention. "Leave?" he repeated, and Roman nodded once, setting something down on the counter. "You still have work," he said, and Luca blinked, slightly thrown off, because for a moment he had expected something else, something more restrictive, more controlled, but instead, this felt normal, and that made it more confusing than anything else. "You are not going to stop me?" Luca asked before he could stop himself, the question slipping out with more edge than he intended, and Roman's expression did not change. "I told you this was an arrangement," he replied calmly, "not confinement." The words settled into the space between them, and Luca found himself watching him more closely now, trying to understand where the boundaries actually were, where the control ended, and where his own choices still existed. He moved toward the counter slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the plate that had been set out. Something simple, but clearly prepared with intention, and for a moment he considered refusing, holding on to that small piece of resistance. But the quiet reminder of his own exhaustion, the steady awareness of what his body needed, made the decision for him, and he sat down without another word. Roman did not sit with him, did not hover, but he did not leave either, his presence steady in the background, like something that did not need to be acknowledged to be felt, and Luca ate in silence, aware in a way he had not been before, of how different this felt from everything he had known, not just the food or the space, but the structure of it, the predictability, the sense that things had been anticipated before he even considered them. "You arranged all of this," Luca said after a moment. Not really a question, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful than defensive, and Roman glanced at him briefly. "Of course," he replied, as if that part had never been in doubt. Luca let out a small breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the fork in his hand. "You do not even ask what I want," he said, and this time there was no sharpness in it, just something closer to realization, something he was still trying to understand. Roman was quiet for a second, not dismissing the statement, not correcting it immediately, and when he spoke, his tone was unchanged, but there was something more deliberate in it now. "If there is something you want, you can say it," he said. "But I will not leave you in a position where you have to struggle for things you should already have." Luca looked at him then, really looked, searching again for the line between control and care, and finding it just as difficult to define as before, because the truth was, this was easier, this was safer, this was everything he had been trying to manage on his own, handed to him without the cost he had expected, and that made it harder to push back against, harder to reject. He lowered his gaze again, his hand moving unconsciously to his stomach as he finished the last few bites, grounding himself in something that still felt like his, still belonged to him. Even here, even now, and for the first time since stepping into Roman's world, he felt something shift, not completely, not enough to trust it fully, but enough to recognize it, a small, reluctant acceptance that maybe, just maybe, not every form of control was meant to take something away, even if he was not ready to stop questioning what it might cost him in the end. 10. Safety does not feel real until something tries to take it away. The first time Lucas stepped outside Roman's world after moving in, it felt different in a way he could not immediately explain. The city the same as it had always been, loud, crowded, and different, but something in him had shifted, a quiet awareness that he was no longer moving through it entirely alone, even if he did not fully understand what that meant yet. He adjusted the strap of his bag as he walked toward the entrance of the building where he worked, the routine familiar, grounding, something he could still hold on to, and for a moment, things almost felt normal again, until he heard it. Luca. The voice cut through everything, sharp and unmistakable, and his steps slowed before he could stop them, his chest tightening instantly as he turned. Already knowing who he would see, Brandon stood a few feet away, looking exactly as he had before, composed, confident, like nothing had changed for him at all, and for a second, Luca felt something old and unwelcome stir in his chest, something he had thought he had left behind. "You are hard to find," Brandon said, his tone almost casual, like this was a coincidence, like he had not gone out of his way to be here, and Luca forced himself to stay still, to not step back, even as every instinct told him to put distance between them. "You should not be here," Luca replied, his voice steady despite the tension building under his skin, his hand unconsciously moving to rest over his stomach, grounding himself in something real. Brandon's gaze dropped. Immediately, catching the motion, his expression sharpening in a way that made Luca's pulse spike. "So it is true," he said quietly, stepping closer, and Luca felt the space shrink, the air tightening around him in a way that felt too familiar. "I told you before, it is not your concern," Lucas said, more firmly now, holding his ground even as his body tensed. Brandon let out a short breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. "You expect me to just walk away?" he asked, his voice lower now, more focused. "After everything?" Luca's jaw tightened. "You already did," he said, the words landing harder than he intended, but he did not take them back. For a brief moment, something flickered across Brandon's face, irritation, maybe something else, but it hardened quickly into something more controlled, more deliberate. "That does not mean I do not get answers," he replied, and there it was again, that sense of entitlement, that quiet assumption that he still had a right to Luca, to anything connected to him. "You do not get anything," Lucas said, his voice sharper now, the line drawn clearly between them, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was the one losing ground. Brandon stepped closer again, not touching, but close enough that Luca could feel the pressure of his presence, the same way he used to, the same way that had once made him feel small. "You always were stubborn," Brandon muttered, his gaze searching Luca's face like he was trying to find something that still belonged to him. "But you cannot just erase what we had." Luca's breath caught for a second, not because the words were true, but because they were familiar, because they echoed something he had once believed, and for a moment, the past and present blurred just enough to make it hard to stay grounded. "I am not trying to erase anything," Lucas said slowly, his voice quieter now, more controlled. "I am just not going back." The words settled between them, heavier than anything else he had said, and Brandon's expression shifted again, something darker this time, something less patient. "You think you have a choice?" he asked, and the question landed differently than it would have before. Because now Luca understood what choice really meant, what it looked like when it was taken away, and what it looked like when it was given in a way that still felt like control. "I do," Lucas said, and this time, there was no hesitation. The silence that followed was sharp, tense, the kind that could tip in either direction, and then, before Brandon could respond, before the moment could shift again, another presence entered the space, quiet but unmistakable, like a change in gravity that made everything else feel smaller. He said no. The voice was calm, steady, and Luca did not need to turn to know who it was. The familiarity of it settling into his chest in a way that was both grounding and unsettling at the same time. Roman stepped into view beside him, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he stood, something in the quiet certainty of his presence that immediately shifted the balance of the moment. Brandon's attention snapped to him, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the man standing next to Luca, the difference between them clear even without words. "And you are?" Brandon asked, his tone edged now, less controlled than before. Roman did not answer immediately, his gaze flicking briefly to Luca, a silent check, a question that was not spoken but clearly understood, and when Luca did not step away, did not object, Roman turned his attention back to Brandon. "The one you should not be speaking to him in front of," he said evenly. Brandon let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head slightly. "I do not remember asking for your permission," he replied. But there was something different now, something less certain than before. Roman took a small step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, but deliberate, and somehow that was enough to make the space feel tighter, more controlled. "You do not need to," he said calmly. "You just need to leave." The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need to be reinforced. And for a moment, Brandon hesitated, his gaze flicking between them, calculating, measuring something he could not quite define. "This is not over," Brandon said finally. His voice lower now, less confident than it had been at the start, but not completely defeated. And then he stepped back, the tension in the air easing just slightly as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the same crowd he had emerged from. Luca exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, the tightness in his chest loosening just enough for him to feel it. And for a second, he just stood there, letting the moment settle, letting the reality of what had just happened catch up with him. Beside him, Roman did not move immediately, his presence steady, unchanged. But when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, less about control and more about something else Luca could not quite name. "Are you all right?" And for the first time, the question did not feel like part of an arrangement. It felt like something closer to concern. 11. Protection can feel a lot like control when you do not know where one ends and the other begins. The ride back was quieter than before, but not in the same way. The silence heavier now, filled with everything that had just happened and everything Luca was still trying to process, his hands resting loosely in his lap, but not relaxed, his thoughts circling the moment over and over again. Brandon's voice, the pressure, and then Roman's, calm, decisive, final. He had said no, and this time, it had held, and that should have felt like relief, but instead it left something more complicated behind, something that did not settle easily. When the car stopped and the doors opened, Lucas stepped out without waiting, needing the movement, the shift, something to ground himself. But the moment he entered the apartment again, the quiet hit him differently, not comforting, not neutral, but enclosing, like the space had closed around him in a way it had not before. Roman followed a step behind, his presence steady as always. But Luca was more aware of it now, more aware of how it filled the room. Without effort, how it shaped the space even in silence. "You should not go there alone anymore," Roman said after a moment, his tone even, like he was stating something already decided, and Luca's shoulders tensed slightly, the words landing harder than they should have. "I have been going there alone this whole time," Luca replied, turning just enough to face him, his voice controlled but edged, because this mattered, because this felt like a line he was not ready to let go of. Roman's expression did not change. "That was before," he said, and the simplicity of it made Luca pause, because it was true, because things were different now, but that did not make it easier to accept. "So now I need permission?" Luca asked, the question sharper than he intended, the frustration slipping through despite his effort to contain it. Roman was quiet for a second, not reacting immediately, and when he spoke, his tone remained steady, but there was something firmer beneath it now, something less flexible. "You need protection," he corrected, and Luca felt that again. That shift where words that sounded reasonable carried weight that was harder to push against. "That is not the same thing," Luca said, his hand moving unconsciously to his stomach, grounding himself, reminding himself of what mattered, of why he had agreed to this in the first place. Roman's gaze followed the motion briefly before returning to Luca's face. "No," he said calmly, "it is not. But in your situation, it is not optional." The words settled heavily between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the tension stretching just enough to make it uncomfortable, but not enough to break. Luca exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he turned away slightly. The frustration still there, but tangled now with something else, something closer to uncertainty, because part of him understood, part of him knew Roman was not wrong. But that did not stop it from feeling like something was being taken from him all the same. You cannot just decide things like that for me, Lucas said quietly, not looking at him now, his voice lower, less confrontational but no less serious. Behind him, Roman took a step closer, not enough to crowd him, but enough that Luca could feel the shift in the air, the change in proximity. I can, Roman said, just as quietly, and there was no arrogance in it, no raised voice. Just a simple statement delivered, with absolute certainty. Because you agreed to let me handle what threatens you. Luca's breath caught slightly at that, the words hitting deeper than he expected, because they were true in a way he could not easily argue with, because this was part of what he had said yes to, even if he had not fully understood what it would look like. That does not mean you get to control everything, Lucas said, turning back now, meeting his gaze again, and for a second, the space between them felt charged, something unspoken passing through it. Roman held his gaze steadily, not backing down, not pushing further, just holding it. And then, after a brief pause, he said, "It means I do not leave you exposed." The answer was simple, but it landed differently, softer in its intention, even if the control behind it remained unchanged. And Luca felt that conflict again, sharp and persistent, the line between being protected and being controlled blurring in a way that made it hard to stand firmly on either side. The silence that followed was quieter this time, less tense, but no less heavy, and Luca looked away first, his shoulders lowering slightly as the fight drained out of him, not because he agreed completely, but because he did not have the energy to keep pushing against something that was not going to move. I do not want to lose myself in this, Luca said finally, the words quieter now, more honest than anything he had said so far. And for the first time, there was no resistance in them, just a statement of fear. Roman did not respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was softer than before, not weaker, but more deliberate. "You will not," he said, and for a moment, Luca wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to that certainty the way Roman seemed to, but trust did not come that easily, not after everything. Still, as the room settled into silence again, Luca found himself standing there, caught between two truths that did not quite fit together, that being here meant safety, and that safety, in Roman's world, came with a cost he was only just beginning to understand. 12. The most dangerous kind of care is the one that feels like control to everyone else, but becomes something else entirely when it is only meant for you. The change did not happen all at once, and that was what made it harder to notice, harder to define, because nothing Roman did was sudden or dramatic. There were no declarations, no clear moments where something shifted from arrangement to something more, only a series of small adjustments that Luca found himself becoming aware of without knowing exactly when they had started. It showed up in the details first, the kind that could be dismissed if he did not look too closely, the way the temperature in the apartment always seemed to match what Luca needed without him saying anything, the way meals appeared at the right time, not forced, not demanded, but always there, always within reach, as if someone had anticipated not just what he required, but when he would require it. At first, Luca had told himself it was just part of the agreement, part of Roman's need for control, for structure. But the longer he stayed, the more that explanation began to feel incomplete, because the control was still there, still present in the way decisions were made before Luca could consider them, but it no longer felt as cold as it had before, no longer as impersonal. One evening, after a longer day than usual, Luca returned to the apartment more exhausted than he expected, his movements slower, his body heavier, and for a moment he paused just inside the doorway, letting the quiet settle around him. But before he could move further, Roman's voice came from the living area, calm as always, "You are late." And Luca almost responded defensively out of habit, but something in the tone made him stop, because it was not accusation, not control, just observation. "Work ran longer," Luca replied, setting his bag down, his voice quieter than usual, and Roman stepped closer then, his gaze moving over Luca briefly, not lingering, but taking in more than it should have at a glance. "You did not eat properly," he said, not asking, and Luca frowned slightly. "I am fine," he answered. automatically, but Roman did not respond to the words, only reached past him toward the counter, where something had already been prepared, simple, warm, ready, as if it had been expected that Luca would need it before Luca himself realized it. Sit, Roman said, not sharply, not forcefully, but with that same quiet certainty that made it difficult to argue. And this time, Luca did not because he felt like he had to, but because he was too tired to resist something that felt easier. He sat, his movements slower, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence different from before, less tense, but no less controlled, and as Luca began to eat, he became aware of Roman's presence again, closer than usual, not hovering, but not distant either, like he had adjusted his position without making it obvious. You should not push yourself like that, Roman said after a moment, his voice lower now, more measured, and Luca let out a small breath. I have been doing it this way for a long time, he replied, not defensive, just stating it as fact. Roman's gaze did not shift. You do not have to anymore, he said, and there was something different in that sentence, something that did not feel like control, even if it still carried the weight of it. Luca paused slightly at that, his hand resting briefly against the edge of the table as he considered the words, because they sounded simple, but they touched something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to think about. You say that like it is that easy, Luca said quietly, not looking at him now, and Roman was silent for a second before responding. It is not easy, he said. It is a decision. And Luca felt that again, the difference in how Roman saw things, the way everything was reduced to something that could be chosen, controlled, managed. And what if I am not ready for that? Luca asked, the question softer now, more honest than before, and for once, Roman did not answer immediately, did not respond with certainty. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Luca had ever heard it. Then you take the time you need, he said, and the shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Luca looked up at that, really looked, searching for the same rigid control he had come to expect, but finding something else layered beneath it, something that did not replace the control, but existed alongside it, changing the way it felt. You are still deciding things for me, Luca said after a moment, but there was less resistance in it now, more observation than accusation, and Roman inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without denying it. Yes, he said, and then, after a brief pause, he added, but not all of them. And that was new, that was different. And Luca felt it immediately, the space that opened within that statement, small, but real. The silence that followed was quieter, more balanced, and as Luca finished eating, he became aware of something else, something he had not expected, that the control had not disappeared, it had not lessened, but it had shifted, narrowed, focused in a way that made it feel less like a cage and more like something built around him specifically, something that adjusted, adapted, something that did not apply to everyone the same way. Roman moved then, just slightly, reaching to take the empty plate from Luca's hand without asking. The motion smooth, natural, but this time, his fingers brushed against Luca's for a fraction longer than necessary, not enough to hold, not enough to claim, but enough to make Luca pause, to notice, to feel the difference. You should rest, Roman said, his voice steady again, but softer at the edges, and Luca nodded without thinking this time. The resistance that had once come so easily now replaced by something more complicated, something that felt less like being told what to do and more like being considered. As he stood, his hand moved again to his stomach, grounding himself. But this time, the gesture felt different, less defensive, more certain, and as he walked toward the room, he realized that the control he had feared was still there, still shaping everything around him, but it no longer felt the same, because somewhere along the way, without him noticing exactly when, he had become something else within it, not just part of the arrangement, not just someone being protected, but someone Roman adjusted for, someone Roman made exceptions for, and that, more than anything, was what unsettled him now, because it meant this was no longer just control, and that made it far more dangerous. 13. The strangest part about falling is not the moment you hit the ground. It is the moment you realize you have already stopped trying to stand on your own. At first, Luca noticed it, not all at once, not as something obvious, but in small, quiet ways that were easy to ignore if he did not look too closely. The way he stopped questioning every decision before accepting it. The way his thoughts no longer raced ahead to prepare for what could go wrong. The way he began to move through each day without the same constant tension that had once defined everything he did. He told himself it was temporary, that this was just a phase, just something he needed until things stabilized, that he would take back control once he was ready, once he had the strength to stand on his own again. But the days passed, and he did not. The awareness came before the understanding, a subtle recognition that something was shifting long before he could explain it. And by the time he finally did, by the time he could see it clearly for what it was, he realized something else, something far more unsettling, that he did not want to undo it anymore. It did not feel like losing control, not in the way he had feared, not in the way he had fought against before, because nothing had been taken from him suddenly. Nothing had been forced. It had simply changed, adjusted, shaped itself around him until the difference between what was his and what was no longer entirely his became harder to define. The days began to blur together in a different way now, not heavy with exhaustion, but steady, structured, predictable in a way that made it easier to breathe, easier to exist without constantly bracing for what might come next. And somewhere within that rhythm, without meaning to, without deciding it consciously, Luca found himself letting go of something he had held on to for so long. The need to carry everything on his own, the need to stand without support, because for the first time, he did not have to. Roman's presence had become constant in a way that no longer felt intrusive. Not something that pressed against Luca's independence, but something that existed alongside it, steady, reliable, shaping the space around him in ways that felt less like restriction and more like something he could lean on without fear of it disappearing. It showed in the smallest moments, the ones that did not demand attention, the way Roman adjusted his schedule without mentioning it, so he was always there when Luca returned, the way he noticed what Luca did not say, stepping in before problems could fully form, the way decisions were still made, still controlled, but no longer felt like they were working against Luca, instead aligning with what he needed before he could even ask for it. One night, the shift became impossible to ignore, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how simple it was, how natural it felt. Luca woke in the middle of the night, his breath catching slightly as that old, instinctive unease surfaced, the kind that used to spiral into something heavier, something harder to control, and for a split second, he was back. There again, alone, uncertain, bracing for something he could not see. But before it could take hold, before the feeling could settle, there was movement beside him, subtle but immediate, and Roman's voice cut through the quiet, low and steady. "You are fine." And Luca did not question it, did not hesitate, did not analyze whether he should believe it, he just did. The words settled into him with a certainty that bypassed everything else, and his body responded before his mind could catch up. His hand reaching out instinctively, finding the edge of Roman's sleeve in the darkness, grounding himself in something real, something solid, and Roman did not pull away, did not react, only shifted slightly closer, enough to make the space feel warmer, more certain, more safe. "Go back to sleep," Roman said quietly, and this time, Luca obeyed without resistance, without the need to prove that he could handle it on his own, his eyes closing again as the tension slipped away faster than it ever had before, because it was easier like this, because it felt right. The realization did not arrive all at once, but it stayed with him, lingering in the quiet spaces between moments, building slowly, steadily, until it became impossible to ignore, that Roman was no longer just part of the arrangement, no longer just someone providing structure or protection, but someone Luca had begun to rely on in a way he had never intended, in a way that felt both inevitable and dangerous. He noticed it in the way his first instinct was no longer to solve everything alone, in the way his thoughts began to include Roman without effort, in the way decisions that once felt heavy now felt lighter simply, because he knew they were not his to carry entirely anymore. It was not dependence in the way he had feared, not weak or desperate, but something deeper, something that rooted itself quietly until it became difficult to separate where Luca ended and Roman's presence began. And somewhere in that realization, there was a brief moment of hesitation, a flicker of awareness that he had crossed a line he could not clearly see, that he had moved further than he had planned, further than he had promised himself he would. But that hesitation did not hold, because the truth was, he did not want to go back. did not want to return to the version of himself who carried everything alone, who stood without support simply because he had no other choice. By the time the memory circled back to where everything had started, to the mall, to the moment Brandon's voice had once cut through the noise and threatened to pull him back into something he had fought so hard to leave behind, Luca understood something he had not before, that he was no longer that person, no longer someone who had to face that kind of pressure alone. And when the memory aligned with the present, when Roman's voice overlapped with that moment, calm and unwavering, he said no. It did not feel like a rescue anymore. It felt like something expected, something certain, something Luca had already come to rely on long before he realized it. And that was the part that stayed with him, the part that lingered. Long after the memory faded, not the fear, not the confrontation, but the quiet, undeniable truth beneath it, that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without deciding it consciously, Luca had stopped standing on his own, and had started trusting that Roman would be there to hold him up, every single time. 14. The difference between being saved and choosing where you belong is the moment you realize you would stay, even if you were free to leave. The mall looked the same as it always had, bright lights, distant noise, people moving past without noticing anything beyond their own lives. And for a moment, Luca stood there in the middle of it, still, grounded, the memory of that first day overlapping so clearly with the present that it almost felt like time had folded in on itself. This was where everything had started, where he had been at his lowest, where he had been pushed, humiliated, left to figure out how to survive on his own, and, for a brief second, he could still feel that version of himself, the uncertainty, the fear, the exhaustion that had weighed down every step, but it did not last, because he was not that person anymore. You came back. The voice broke through his thoughts, familiar, unwelcome, but no longer overwhelming, and Luca turned slowly, his expression calm in a way it had never been before. Brandon standing there again, just like before, but this time, something about the dynamic felt different before a single word was spoken. I did, Luca replied, his voice steady, not defensive, not sharp, just certain, and Brandon studied him for a moment, his gaze narrowing slightly, as if trying to understand what had changed, what had shifted in a way he could not control anymore. You look different, Brandon said, and Luca almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was true in ways Brandon would never fully understand. I am, Luca answered simply. There was a pause, brief but heavy, and then Brandon took a step closer, the same move he had made before, the same assumption that proximity still gave him something, but this time, Luca did not feel it the same way, did not feel smaller, did not feel like he needed to step back. You cannot seriously think this lasts, Brandon said, his tone edged with something sharper now, less confident than before. Whatever this is, it is temporary. Luca let out a quiet breath, not frustrated, not shaken. Just done, and for the first time, he did not look at Brandon like someone who had taken something from him, but like someone who no longer had anything to give. Maybe it is, Luca said, and that alone made Brandon pause, because it was not the answer he expected, but I am still choosing it. The words settled between them, heavier than anything else, because this time, it was not about survival, not about necessity, not about being pushed into a corner. It was a choice, clear and intentional, and that changed everything. Brandon's expression shifted, something tightening beneath the surface. You think he is going to keep choosing you? He asked, the doubt sharper now, searching for something to break, something to weaken. And for a moment, there was silence again, but this time, it did not feel uncertain, it felt settled. I do not need to think about it, Luca said quietly, his hand moving to rest over his stomach, not out of fear this time, but out of habit, out of grounding. I already know what I am choosing. And then, before Brandon could respond, before the moment could stretch any further, that presence returned, not sudden, not overwhelming, just there, like it always was when it mattered. That will not be necessary. Roman's voice was calm, steady, cutting through the tension without effort, and Luca did not need to turn to know he was there, did not need confirmation, because he could feel it, the same way he always could now. Brandon's attention shifted immediately, his frustration barely concealed this time. You again, he muttered, but there was less certainty in it than before, less control. Roman stepped into place beside Luca, close enough to be felt, not claimed, not held, just present, and when he spoke, his tone was unchanged, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "You have said everything you needed to say," he stated, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. Brandon exhaled sharply, his gaze flicking between them, searching for something to push against, something to disrupt. But there was nothing there for him to take anymore. Nothing unsteady, nothing uncertain. "This is not over," Brandon said finally. The same words as before, but weaker now, less grounded. And this time, they did not carry the same weight. Luca did not respond, because he did not need to, because the outcome no longer depended on what Brandon said or did. And after a moment longer, Brandon stepped back, the distance growing until he turned and disappeared into the crowd once again. But this time, it felt final, not because he would never return, but because he no longer held any place in Luca's world. The silence that followed was different from before, lighter, steadier, and for a moment, Luca just stood there, letting it settle, letting the absence of that pressure sink in, and then he turned slightly, meeting Roman's gaze fully for the first time in that moment. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet understanding that passed between them, something unspoken but clear, and Luca felt it, the difference, the shift from everything that had come before, from arrangement, from control, from necessity, into something else entirely. "You did not have to come," Luca said softly, not as a rejection, not as resistance, just as truth. Roman regarded him for a moment, his expression as composed as ever, but his voice, when he spoke, carried something quieter beneath it, something that had not been there before. "I know," he said. The answer lingered, simple but meaningful, and Luca held his gaze for a second longer before speaking again, his voice steady, certain in a way it had never been before. "I am not here because I have to be," he said, the words deliberate, chosen. "I am here because I want to be." The space between them shifted again, subtle but undeniable, and for the first time, there was no weight of obligation in it, no unspoken terms, no invisible lines defining what this was supposed to be. Roman was quiet for a moment, longer than usual, as if considering something beyond the immediate, and when he stepped closer this time, it was different, not control, not positioning, just intention. His hand lifted slightly, not to take, not to claim, but to rest lightly against Luca's, the contact brief, deliberate, enough to be felt without being held, and Luca did not pull away. Then, "Stay," Roman said, his voice low, steady, but no longer distant. And this time, it was not an instruction, not an expectation, just an invitation. Luca exhaled softly, something in his chest settling in a way it never had before, the last piece falling into place, and he nodded once, not because he was agreeing to something new, but because he was finally acknowledging what had already become true. "I will," he said, and this time, it was not about survival, not about safety, not about control. It was about choice, clear and undeniable. And as they stood there, the noise of the mall fading into the background, Luca realized that somewhere along the way, without even noticing when it happened, Roman had stopped being the person who saved him and had become the place he chose to belong.